how did Andre Norton's Witch World influence the early editions, particularly first edition of Dungeons and Dragons? This is part of my Appendix N series, or Appendix N chats, where I talk about how the literature listed by Gary Gygax in the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide, how that kind of bled into or influenced or shaped Dungeons and Dragons in the early days. And this is maybe, so Andre Norton lived from 1912 to 2005. She is a very prolific and, for a period, quite influential and important sci-fi and fantasy writer. She wrote up till fairly near her death as well, so incredibly long career, really. Nothing listed under her name in the 1E Dungeon Master's Guide. So we don't have a particular book we go to and say, oh, yeah, this is the Norton book that we picked up that Gary read and liked. Really, her most significant work or set of works is The Witch World. This is one volume. There are another couple of omnibuses out that came out during the 90s. Otherwise, you can get classic editions of paperbacks and stuff online, not massively in print at this point. When nothing is listed in Appendix N, I find either you're talking about a pervasive influence, a really broad influence, so Lord Dunsany, I think, is an example of that, or you're talking about something, so either it's very pervasive or it's incredibly specific. There's a special case in place. You're not talking about like, Gary really liked this one book. You're talking about something where either it's pervasive or there's something special in the situation. And that's certainly true with Norton. So before we talk about the Witch World, she pretty much uniquely for an Appendix N author played D&D with Gary in 1976, and she wrote the first Dungeons and Dragons novel, Quag Keep, in 1978, just after her death. A sequel, Return to Quag Keep, was published, co-authored by Gene Rabe, another early D&D writer. So that's an interesting pedigree, isn't it? That she is both an influential author in her own right, but also is linked into D&D fiction before the DMG comes out. So looking at Witch World, there's not obviously anything unique here that you like. So I've given examples in The Incomplete Enchanter by Sprague de Camp and Pratt. The way in which the Norse story in that, where Harold Shea has to deal with giants, seems really obvious an inspiration for the Against the Giants setup with the different giant bases. Or again, you look at particular magic items in particular stories, or you look at lore and chaos in particularly Three Hearts and Three Lions, and you think, this is really obvious, isn't it? There's nothing like that in the Witch World, nothing like that in any work of hers that I have heard of or know. There's no specific monsters, there's no specific situations or setups. There is an example of psionics, which could be very loosely drawn on to see, but then there's a lot of other psionic stuff going on in sci-fi in that kind of, both in the classic and in the New Wave period. The idea of psychic powers, Gary did not, I think, come to the colder in the Witch World and say, that's where I'll get psionics from. They're not even particularly similar. But a really obviously Gygaxian thing in these stories, in the Witch World stories, is it's a particular meld of themes, that these are there is a world to which people hop. They're not world hopping. There are portals into a world where people come and they settle there and, have multi-generational, civilizations, cultures there. Includes there being a merge or portaling between technology rich worlds, magic rich worlds. There's clashes in the stories between magic rich and technology rich societies. This is very prevalent, though sometimes submerged, in Gary's works. By that I mean the melding of genre, the clash of different types of, how would you put it? In a Clarkian sense, the different magical bases, different power bases, basically. Most obviously, S3 Expedition to the Barrier Peaks. That's a really obvious one where you have an alien ship crash and they have to investigate it. Not that this would be a unique place for that sort of influence, but it's one place you could see this is a strong, pervasive theme in Norton. Or again, the advice on game mashing Gamma World and Boot Hill into Dungeons and Dragons in the DMG, or the early description of the planes also in the DMG. Some of the Castle Greyhawk sub-levels, or rather the weirdness and portaling aspect of them. Whatever Gary put into Q1, Queen of the Demon Wed Pits, which is obviously a planar adventure that is very obviously trying to draw on themes of that late era TSR Gygax and some of the stuff he's starting to write about and think about, even though it wasn't chiefly by him, as by Dave Sutherland. So there is a shared interest. You've got magic users with sometimes what seem to be magic items. They come up against tech users or against lycanthropes in one book, or against all kinds of stuff. And no doubt that stuff was in the background for Gary. So when I read this, I think this is the part of the general mush and melange and soup that influences Gygax. And when I read it, I think, yes, this obviously would be the kind of thing that would influence him. You can tell, especially when you've read other Appendix N entries and you know the general texture of these things. But with Norton specifically, I think there's also a virtuous circle in play that ends up with her in Appendix N, more than some books that he'd forgotten, perhaps. Gary likes the book. He's like, man, that Year of the Unicorn, that was a good book. I like the were creatures in that one. She plays Dungeons and Dragons, and then she writes a novel. So that's the cycle, and it continues. And Gary's like, oh, Appendix N, and she becomes a secured part of the canon in her own minor way. And Quag Keep, that novel, it's in this near Greyhawk world where actual D&D players, get sucked into the world and become heroes. They have classes, they have level titles, and the level titles are in-world things. And there's physically palpable war going on between law and chaos, which is obviously Norton channeling Gygax, channeling Poul Anderson in Three Hearts and Three Lions, more than Moorcock, because the way that Law and Chaos are described in Three Hearts and Three Lions is very much in those terms. And, this is something where you think, wow, that is such a multi-layered reading of the tradition coming in. A particularly Norton touch in Quag Keep is that one of the characters is a sort of a berserker, so a proto-barbarian perhaps, and they can change into a bear, is it, or a boar, something like that, and they are known, one of the other characters thinks them as a were, which is the title used in Year of the Unicorn, which is in Annals of the Witch World. It's used with the shape changes there. Not were creature, not lycanthrope, but wares with a capital W. So that this Norton touch is something that draws forward into official D&D fiction. Not into official D&D design by Gary, but into official D&D fiction. Very interesting. So I think Quag Keep is actually mostly an interesting reflection or record of actual play, and a translation of a gaming experience than a normal story. And so it's a record of earliest D&D. And in that sense, so Quag Keep is a record rather than an inspiration, obviously. But in that sense, you start seeing Norton as part of this cycle of interpretation in earliest D&D to do with its sources. And it's tutelary, I think, therefore, in terms of the way in which the sci-fi and fantasy of that area fed in and fed out of D&D. And obviously now all fantasy fiction, even really all action sci-fi, is influenced in some way by D&D in one way or another. So maybe I've missed some stuff in terms of Norton's influences. Tell me in the comments if I have. But yeah, I think if you've got any other thoughts on the ways in which there is a kind of multi-layer process of influence, that'd be good to hear about too. And anything else. See you soon. Till next time.